Hey everyone, welcome to this Developing Copilots with Azure AI Studio course. My name is Peter Detender. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer from Redmond, Washington. I've been a trainer for a bit more than 14 years, but within the Microsoft role, it's a little bit over 5 years now. The trainings that I typically deliver are Azure Architecting, Developing, as well as Azure DevOps, and now moving more to AI and Copilot courses. This specific course is divided into 6 sessions. In the first session, you'll get an introduction to Azure AI Studio. Session 2 dives into exploring, deploying, and chatting with the language models. Session 3 focuses on comparing model optimization strategies. Session 4, it's all about identifying prompt flow components, followed by Session 5, where we dive in more into prompt flow, but a little bit more on developing your custom Copilot using prompt flow technology. And then finally, in Session 6, I'll show you how to evaluate your custom Copilot. In Session 1, we'll cover an introduction to Azure AI Services, as well as Azure AI Studio. So let's get started with Session 1. So with that, let's jump into this first section, where I would like to introduce you to Azure AI Studio. Now, when you think about Azure AI Studio, and I'll show you in some demos later on how it actually works and how cool it actually gives you all those Azure AI integration capabilities. But let's start with maybe setting the scene a little bit, because you might recognize a few components. Now, in short, when you think about Azure AI Studio, it's really that I would say the new centralized management portal for your Azure AI integration. Now, you might have some experience with machine learning. You might have used Azure Machine Learning for the last couple of years. Maybe you were one of the first adopters of Azure OpenAI and using OpenAI Studio, where the challenge, I would say, for developers on one side, for data scientists on the other side, is that you have so many different portals to go through. And that's exactly what Azure AI Studio tries to help you with. It's your one and only single pane of glass for managing your Azure AI environment. So there's a small screenshot here, and again, I'll show you in a live demo later on. But in short, it's really that central point. So it's allowing you to integrate your data models. It's going to allow you to, first of all, start your Azure AI services and actually deploying them from there. Once you have your Azure AI service up and running, you need to start managing it. So that's where the models are coming in. That's where you're going to create prompt flows. It's also where you're going to see that playground integration, allowing a developer or an AI engineer to actually test the models and validate them. So again, just a couple of examples here to show you what it looks like. And then later on, once you have everything up and running in your AI Studio, you're going to use the same environment for running your model testing, maybe optimizing performance, maybe validating security integrations, and anything else that, again, you need as a developer and as a data scientist. Now, looking at it from a broader perspective, you might start with, I'm running my own AI service, and it's just me, like Peter in this case, and I'm going to build my AI environment. I deploy my Azure AI service, I'm going to test it out, I deploy a model, I'm going to test it out with the playground, and everything is working fine. But in a typical corporate environment, it's not just one developer or one data scientist using all Azure AI integration. So what we have now with AI Studio is a little bit broader project-oriented scope. So it starts with an AI hub. That's the parent level, you could say, for managing your AI resources. So when you deploy your AI service, it's going to give you an endpoint. It's running the actual service behind the scenes as a platform, as a service capability. And it's also going to give you the key, the secret you need to actually interact with your endpoints. Now, when you create an AI hub, it's that starting point. Within the AI Hub, you're going to define permissions. You're going to manage also your machine learning compute in the backend. So I tend to say it's a little bit closer to managing the environment, managing the higher level. And that's where I like the definition that it's like the parent object in your AI topology. Within an AI Hub resource, you can create one, and preferably, I would say, multiple projects. So the project lives a little bit more on a lower level, where you're going to define the deployments, which kind of models do I want. You can combine multiple models, and obviously you could also spread them out. creating one dedicated project for one dedicated model, all depending on how you're going to develop your applications and bringing in your AI solutioning. Next to that, it also allows you to integrate other tools, what we describe later on as RAG or retrieval augmented generation. And again, also using the project to evaluate, to validate the performance, and to overall manage everything that belongs to that project. So in short, you start with deploying AI service. Next to that, you're going to deploy an AI hub, and from there, you're going to define projects. Within the project, obviously keeping security in mind, it's not that everyone within your organization or within the AI team can connect to everything. So there is quite some security role-based access in place, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, I briefly mentioned integrating AI services, deploying the hub, deploying the projects, interacting with the data models. But when you think about this broader developing solution architecture, there's a lot more than just deploying your AI service. You need to think about data endpoints. It might be the traditional Azure storage. You might connect to maybe machine learning backends, but you might also connect to external services running within the Microsoft Azure environment, maybe connecting to GitHub for your deployment repositories, and so many other Azure services. Thinking of Key Vault, for example, to store your keys, the ones from your development solution code, but also obviously the keys coming from your Azure AI service itself. Out of the hub and project level, it also allows you to manage those external and Azure broader connections. Now, I'll walk you through later on in a demo how to actually build out your connections, but it's not super difficult. So you're going to start with deploying, again, your AI hub. You're going to deploy your project, and from there, you can have that option to integrate your external connections. So one example here is, for example, connecting to other services, like I already mentioned, OpenAI integration, although it's not the only language model integration we offer, but I'll talk about that later. Or, for example, integrating search. You might also connect to GitHub. You might integrate with your API keys, the ones from the AI service, or maybe the ones from other examples that you want to bring into your applications as well. And then last, why not connecting to data sources? Already mentioned, storage accounts would be a good example. Data lake storage could be another example, or maybe vector databases, if you already know a bit about those ones, to optimize, again, the retrieval augmented generation. So a lot of those components are already there. And again, think for a minute about outside of the AI Studio, because that's really the core of this section, right? To get you into that mindset, like, I already have all those building blocks in my Azure environment, but now I want to bring them in one single management environment. And that's really what AI Studio is about. So with that, we're at the end of our first little section here. And I talked about AI Studio, but I think it's even more cool to actually show you how it's going to work. So from here, I'll walk through a quick overview of the overall Azure AI Studio. From there, I'm going to show you how to create a hub and how to create multiple projects. And then last, showing you how that external connection integration actually works. So in this first demo, it's all about how to get started with our Azure AI Studio. Now, I talked about how amazing AI Studio is and bringing all the pieces that I would say an Azure AI management team needs. But to help you a little bit, like seeing the difference with it, I would say more traditional tools that we have so far, I'm in my Azure portal, where as the cloud team, maybe the Azure admin team, there is that interaction with Azure AI from the resources perspective. So what it means is I would go into my resource group. I would pick my resource group here. And as you can see, this is an example where I deployed an Azure OpenAI service, where from there I would go in and I can find the bare minimum details that I need from, again, a resource perspective. I have my endpoints, I can pick up my connection keys, and from there I would hand it over to the developers to start working in the Azure OpenAI Studio. That looks a little bit like this, where I'm not going to spend a lot of time on like the traditional way of working, because in the end, it's all about the new way using Azure AI Studio. But if you were one of the early adopters of OpenAI Studio, you probably know how this works. We have our settings on the side with the different models we can deploy, the different completions, testing it out here in the middle using the playground and defining some deployment parameters on the right-hand side. And then to make our AI services team complete, we also bring in typically the machine learning team, where they again have their own portal. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but just in this easy example, we have 3 different portals maybe being used across 3 different teams. Now, all of that is gone with Azure AI Studio. So what we have in Azure AI Studio is basically all the same information from those 3 portals, and I didn't open all of them actually, but at least 3 portals as a minimum, where now it's all getting condensed in one single overview. You can directly connect to ai.azure.com. As you can see up here, obviously I'm authenticating with the correct permissions, and from there I can start working with my Azure AI environment. If I have resources already in place, I can immediately move on. But as you learned from the presentation part, the next step from here is organizing my environment from, I would say, a broader team collaboration perspective. What we're talking about here is the hubs. So from within the homepage of my AI Studio, I already have a few hubs prepared for my demo environment that I'll move around throughout the different demos in part 1, part 2. But I'd like to show you live how this actually gets created. So we're going to do new hub, and we're going to provide a name. So to make sure that it's a little bit aligned, I'm going to call this one the Demo Hub Live, because that's what we're doing right now. I connect to my subscription. It needs a resource group, can be an existing one that my cloud team already prepared, or why not, we could create a new one. And obviously here the assumption is that you do have the permissions to actually create resource groups. We select a location. I'm going to use Sweden for now. You'll find out later on in some other demos why I'm doing that. And obviously I also need to connect to an Azure AI service. Now, going back to the responsibilities maybe of our cloud team, we could take a step back asking them to deploy Azure AI services first, or why not, again, assuming we do have the permissions in place, I can deploy everything straight away from here. So I'm going to call this the Demo Hub Live Hub, where it's all getting created for me. I'm not going to spend time on connecting to Azure AI Search because I'll talk about that later on. So from here, it's just next create. And what it's going to do here is pre-deploying all the core building blocks that I need for managing my Azure AI environment. I got my Azure AI service that's getting deployed over here. I got my hub getting created. And on the side, I got a storage account and Key Vault. The storage account dependency is being used for storing, for example, custom data that we're going to bring in our AI custom copilot solution. And we're going to use Key Vault at some point in time to preferably store secrets or any other credentials that we need in our solution. This is going to take a couple of minutes depending on location. So I'll just wait for this deployment to complete. Now there is another way to actually do the same thing, where from within my Azure portal, I can search for Azure AI Studio. As you can see here, a lot of those building blocks, like my Demo Hub Live, is nicely showing up here. Now I can do the same from here, like again, creating a new AI hub. And that's again, just setting the scene on who's taking responsibility, like who has the permissions to actually deploy them. It could be an AI engineer, it could be the cloud team, like again, looking at it from an infrastructure resource perspective, where now you're going to see that some of these settings here on top provide you more granular options. So I'll deploy this in another resource group just to speed up the demo a little bit. So this could be my second Demo Hub Live. I'm going to use a friendly name. I'm going to use my project group. It's connecting to my Azure AI service. Where now next it's offering me additional options for my storage account. I can still create a new one or pick an existing one. I can also specify how my Azure AI Hub and the Studio will be available from a connectivity perspective, like it's all publicly available. Or you could connect to the Azure portal, you can connect to Studio, but only from within a private trusted network, like a VPN hybrid connection would be a good example here. We got integration for encryption, so integrating our keys. And then also another interesting one is defining a managed identity for our Azure AI Hub. If you're a bit familiar with the preferred, I would say recommended way of working today in Azure around secrets and managing permissions, it's typically creating a system-assigned identity or a user-assigned identity, where later on you're going to use that to, for example, define permissions towards the storage account, permissions towards the Azure Key Vault, and that's where the AI Hub as the Azure resource is now turned into an Entra ID identity object. All of that is obviously done from the previous part of my demo out of that Studio new Hub deployment wizard, but I just wanted to show you a little bit how it actually works in the background. So from here, my new demo hub live is actually live. And what we immediately see here is an interaction with connected resources. So we have our OpenAI service that's getting deployed out of that wizard. Obviously, we do have our AI service. Now, I talked in the presentation about connecting to external resources. So what we can do here is establishing a new connection, and we have a full set of options to choose from. I could deploy yet another OpenAI service integration, connecting two different AI models, integrating search, but I'll talk about that in another session later today. I can interact with other AI integration using OpenAI, where it's now just asking for an AI link, like the endpoint, providing API keys. So just to show you quickly how this works, I'm going to integrate with AI content safety. I already have that resource up and running, so it's again just another Azure resource. And what I'm doing here is now creating that integration, like out of my AI solution here, where I'm building the hub, I'm building the project. I'm now allowing connectivity from that hub, from the project, into the, in this case, AI content safety resource. So I'm just going to add the connection. And from there, it is connected, all good. And if I refresh my portal, it's going to nicely show up here. So the main idea is, again, we built the hub out of the AI Studio portal, and that's where we create our projects. Now, I didn't really show you how to do that, so let's move on here. I got my hub as the parent, and I'm going to create a project. Now, there are obviously some guidelines that I would recommend looking into around naming conventions. So as you can see here, I'm creating my studio called Demo Hub Live. I create a hub, Demo Hub Live hub, and within I'm creating the Demo Hub Live project. Why I'm doing that, it's just because if we switch back to our Azure portal, you can see that now within the Azure AI Studio level, the naming could become a little bit complex if you're not following a clear naming convention. The creation of the project typically doesn't take all that long. And then from there, we can start testing it. So I'm going to give it another couple of seconds here. So after just a couple of seconds, my project is now live. So up here in the portal, I'm on the hub level, and within I'm now on the project level. This is really where we bring in like a lot of the familiar components. If you ever used OpenAI Studio before, a lot of that is brought in. We can test our deployments, we can test our AI engine using the chat functionality in the playground. And then later on in some other sessions, we're also going to talk about prompt flow, we're going to talk about fine-tuning, and we're going to create our data sets. We're now from just that menu on the left-hand side, it should be clear that we're not only bringing in the actual resource creation, like step one, we're now also bringing in a project mindset, how to organize your resources, how to organize the assets, and we're also bringing in quite some functionality that I would say maybe more traditionally was dedicated to our data scientists out of the machine learning portal. So to make sure that everything is working as expected, I'm just gonna validate my scenario where I'm trying to use my chat setup. Now this is not working, why not? Because I still need to deploy my models. Now I didn't talk about this because we're just at step one, setting the scene, introducing AI Studio. So I'm gonna move on with the rest of the presentation and discussing how to actually deploy models. So now you have a pretty good idea about Azure AI Studio. So we walked you through the deployment of the Azure AI service. It's really the starting point of everything, right? And then I walked you through the setup of the Azure AI Studio Hub, the project, and eventually brought in a connector. Now, I know that you're probably waiting for more technical content. You want to see how to actually start developing that AI integration, how to really build your custom copilots. Now, before I move on with the more technical stuff, let's focus a little bit more on responsibilities. Now, if you think about generative AI, it's mind-blowing. But it also means that it's scary for some customers. And that's where you, as a developer, you need to think about how can I make sure that my application, and specifically the custom Copilot integration, if you want, is not getting misused. Misused in a way that it's not exposing information that it should not expose. But maybe also thinking about compliance, thinking about overall responsibilities, thinking about fairness. Like you don't want that AI engine to be biased. So that's where, as a solution architect and as a developer, you need to think about. Now, to help you with that, Microsoft actually created the responsible generative AI framework. And that's going to allow you to really think about how do I integrate that amazing generative AI solution into my applications, new applications or existing ones, and knowing that everything is going to run in a responsible mindset. Now, obviously, like anything else with a framework, it requires some planning. So it's not just like, oh, I'm going to go out, I deploy my Azure AI service, I got my hub, got my project. Obviously, I'm going to bring in my development code, interacting with the AI SDKs, but it's also about really planning how to use it in a responsible way. Now, there's 4 sections, I would say, in that responsible framework that's going to help you with it. So first of all, you need to identify. Identifying means, what is my application like? I'm going to use a chat integration. I'm going to use it to maybe provide a help desk-like support chat conversation with my customers, or I'm going to integrate it as an easier communication tool within my team, or maybe you're looking into like an interactive retail solution. And again, any other example would be valid as well. Now, out of the identify scenario, you're going to define potential harms. What can go wrong with my application if I start using it? And obviously, later on, I'm going to walk you through how to actually protect or integrate that protection mechanism into your solutioning. Now, once you have the identification phase done, you're going to look into measuring. So what we're doing with measuring is really defining, once we know what potentially could go wrong out of the identification scenario, we identified all the harms, and then using the measuring, like what's really the impact? How really, really wrong can it go? From there, obviously, once you know what potentially can go wrong, it's all about the solution, mitigating the problem. We have the harms, and from there, we're going to build multiple layers in our solution that I'll talk about later on how to actually do that. Integrating prompt flow is one good example. Integrating prompt engineering, defining a system message, and all those components will come back later in other sections in the training. But just know that it's not about only detecting it, but also, yes, we do have a solution for that. And then last, that's the operate phase, where you're going to bring in all identification components, measuring them, mitigating them, and eventually being quite sure that your application is running as responsible as it should be. Now, once we identified, we know what potentially could go wrong out of the harm, and we find a mitigation, like how to really fix and actually maybe avoiding the problem, right? It's really about operating it. Now, what do we mean by operating responsible generative AI? It's really about understanding that it's not a one-time shot. Why not? First of all, because those large language models are continuously getting updated, which means that you also need to go through that validation again. Now, just using OpenAI GPT as an example, it started a couple of years ago with GPT-2. Then we moved to GPT 3.5, where I think it's where really the world adoption, you could say, started. But in the meantime, we also have GPT 3.5 Turbo, we have GPT-4, and GPT-4o as one of the most recent scenarios. Now, going back to that responsible AI mindset, it's really about you knowing that whenever the large language model is changing, like adopting a new version, you need to go through that testing phase again. Next to that, you're going to release your solution. You're going to bring in other examples into your, or other resources, I should say, into your scenario, where maybe out of your data scientists, the data set might change as well. You're going to bring in maybe customer information, product information in like a retail example, or like a travel agency, one of the demo scenarios I use later on. And your data set might change, which now again means that you have to go through that cycle again to validate, like, are all the core building blocks, including the data, including the language models that my application is using, is it following that responsible framework? Now, the way to do that is using the Azure AI content security and safety. Now, zooming in a little bit on some of the features from that content safety framework, it's, for example, prompt shields. So one of the scenarios we have is system prompts. Now, I'll talk about system prompts later on, showing you how it actually can manipulate your AI solution, your custom copilots, right? Where you're going to define, hey, my dear AI engine, you have this kind of functionality. You can answer Azure questions because you're an Azure technical trainer, or maybe you're acting as a travel agent, but you cannot respond anything outside of that boundary. That's the prompt shield scenario. We're also going to talk about groundness. Now, groundness is really the functionality or the feature where you're going to try and avoid what I would describe as the AI engine hallucinating. What it means is that in the end, an AI engine is not all that intelligent. It recognizes keywords based on the prompts, your questions from the user or the customer, and based on the question, it's going to provide an answer. So simplifying it a little bit, you could almost say that the only purpose of the AI engine is providing an answer. Now, the thing is that that answer is not always 100% accurate. That's what we call hallucinating, right? Where now what we can do is integrating groundness, and the scenario is called groundness detection. But what we're doing there is really providing a more specific data set. Like the example I shared, if we're going to build like a travel automation engine or a travel agency generative AI engine solution into our broader application, we're going to inject our own custom data. The RAG solutioning, the retrieval augmented generation, is also perfectly fitting in that groundness. Next to that, we have, for example, an integration for protecting copyright. So if you want to build any application, or maybe using DALL-E from OpenAI, like the image generation engine, right? It's protecting you from integrating copyrighted material, where obviously there's a lot of good reasons to do that, to maybe even avoid any lawsuits. And then last, we also have custom categories, which means that if you're not using the prompt shields, if you're not using groundness, or maybe you're not happy with combining all three of them, you can still define your own custom categories, where you're in control as the developer, the AI solution engineer. You're responsible for bringing in your own categories to, again, avoid like bias, to maybe avoid specific keywords, and just making sure that, again, your solution runs in a responsible way. Now, to show you how you can actually integrate this in your overall solution architecture, I'll talk a little bit, and actually not really talking, but showing you how Responsible AI Toolbox, one of the Microsoft features within your AI solution, can actually help you with that. So I promised you a demo for the Responsible AI. Now, I don't really have, I would say, a full up and running demo scenario, but I wanted to point out the dashboard where you can find all the information that you need. So the starting point would be responsibleaitoolbox.ai. And from there, you can find all the information you need. So you connect to Responsible AI Toolbox, and from there you can start reading through. It's providing you an extensive overview of the process, like I explained during the part of the presentation. You're going to start with identifying potential risks. You're going to diagnose them, and then preferably, I would say, from there, you're going to look into mitigating the problem. Now, quite important is also that model comparison, and I'll bring that in another section of the presentation later on, where it's all about comparing, because integrating responsibility is not a one-time shot. Like, I'm going to deploy my model, I'm going to run the validation, and we're basically done, because there's a lot more to it. Now, if you want to integrate this into your own applications, in the backend, it's running a Python script. So you would run like pip install RAI for responsible AI widget, and that's what you find on the GitHub repo. Now again, there's an extensive set, a full collection of workbooks, a full collection of flows. Depending a bit on the language, depending on the language model you're going to use, there's a full set of options you can choose from. So I don't want to expand too much on this because we got so much other content to cover in this virtual training day, but at least I wanted to highlight, like, without the responsible AI concepts, without really understanding them, it could become challenging in the end when you start publishing and really using your custom copilots in production. Now, since we're talking about responsible AI, let me bring in another component that actually links even closer to our Azure AI scenarios, and that's content safety. Remember in the previous demo, we talked about security, we talked about integrating responsible AI, and this is, I would say, one of the other scenarios. Now we integrate our content safety, so you deploy it as a service, and I showed you right in the previous demo that you can build that integration, the connection out of our AI Studio Hub and project, and from here we can start interacting with it. So you go to contentsafety.cognitive.azure.com, and from there, step number 1 here, you're going to identify your resource. So I'm linking it to my demo hub one, that's our sample project we're using, and there's a couple of options here to just play with it a little bit, testing it out. So I'm going to use an easy option here. I want to run a sample test against safe content, where now I'll make it a little bit bigger. The example is chopping tomatoes and cutting them into cubes, wedges are a great way to practice your knife skills. Now you can imagine what we're trying to do here. We're using some sort of, I would say, a dangerous item like a weapon. That's the knife. And we're like chopping and cutting and all those words that might trump you off a little bit. Like, oh my God, we're maybe murdering someone. It's part of, I don't know, like a horror story that we're maybe trying to build up or whatnot. So we're going to test the safety of this kind of sentence out of our prompt, or if you want in a real life custom copilot, we're going to run the test. And what it's going to do here is analyzing it. So it's telling me this content has been allowed. It's based on some filtering, and it's going to also identify the different categories. For each and every of the categories, it's going to identify if it's safe or unsafe, and if there's any risk, if there's a medium risk, low risk, or high risk. And that's how you can validate the prompts, how you can validate the overall functionality, and again, making sure that the custom copilots that you're developing are actually keeping responsible AI as a mindset as well. So with that, let's move on with the next part of the presentation. So now we talked also about, I would say, the quite important responsible AI and how the responsible AI toolbox can help you with really identifying and recognizing and hopefully mitigating the responsible issues in your examples. Let's move on and talk a bit more back to our AI Studio. One of the examples that I already showed you is I'm the AI engineer, or I'm the developer, or I'm maybe the Azure Cloud Solution Architect, and I'm the person deploying AI Hub. I'm the person managing AI Studio. I'm going to create my project. But again, in a real life scenario, it's probably a little bit more complex than that. And that's where you really need to think about defining permissions. Now, permissions in AI Studio, so really defining who can connect to the hubs, who can connect to the projects, and even more important, who can connect to the actual AI service endpoints using the keys and building your generative AI copilots. It's all about defining permissions. Now, if you're a little bit familiar with Azure already, the way we use that is RBAC, role-based access control. Now, RBAC is available as a specific Azure AI Studio integration. What it means is that you're going to define specific permissions within the Azure environment using the built-in roles. Now, if you think about what kind of role do I need for my team, it's probably owner, contributor, or reader. But that might actually be a little bit too elevated. Now, reader, not really. It's just going to give you read permissions, right? And I would say this might be a valid role for like maybe a project manager, maybe a business unit manager. who wants to follow up on how your development cycle of the AI engine, the generative copilots, is actually working. But owner and contributor, I would say, are a little bit more tricky. With owner permissions, you get the freedom to manage to deploy whatever you want in the AI Studio environment. So do you really need that permission? I would say most probably yes, but not for the whole AI team or the whole Azure team. So only a handful of users, developers, data scientists maybe should get access with owner permissions. Why? Because with owner permissions, you get access to the hubs, you get access to the projects, you can deploy the models, but on top of that, you can also change and set permissions. So that's where the security is becoming quite important. So following our Microsoft best practices on least amount of privileges, we would now move to contributor. And even a contributor permission might still be too elevated. So what we can do from here is moving to Azure AI specific roles. Now, what's the difference between the previous one, Azure roles, and Azure AI specific roles? It's where, again, we're reusing, if you want, the RBAC concept from Azure. Now, if you deploy an Azure AI service, it belongs to a resource group. The resource group belongs to an Azure subscription. The subscription belongs to a tenant. So we're really following that hierarchy. Now, what it means is that if you do have permissions on, let's say, a subscription as an owner, like in my demo environment, the Peter account, you could say, is owner of the subscription, which by default means that I'm an owner of all the resource groups I deploy, which also means I'm an owner of all the resources I'm deploying within. Now, quite important is also that being an owner or being a contributor, it allows you to manage Azure services. It doesn't always mean that you have access to actual content. So using a storage account as an easy example, I would need explicit data blob permissions, for example, to interact with my data store endpoints. Although I do have the owner to manage the Azure service. And it's about the same with the AI-specific roles. So what we have here, I would say one of the prime ones, since we're talking about developing custom copilots, will be the Azure AI developer role. That role is going to allow you to manage most of the usage, the functionalities, the features within AI Studio. So it is going to allow you to deploy large language models. It's going to allow you to configure and run the prompt flows that we'll talk about later on. It's going to allow you to define system messages. And it's going to allow you to build indexes, to interact with data sets and whatnot. So a pretty broad role permission, but really specifically tied to what I would say you as an Azure AI solution developer actually needs. And then from there, you can make custom roles. You can make them even more granular. Or another example here is the Azure AI Inference Deployment Operator. So it's a little bit more limited in scope what that role permission can do, but it would still be a viable option. Because again, the AI spectrum is quite broad. You're going to bring in parts of your Azure architecture. So maybe your cloud team, your cloud center of excellence is going to have certain permissions to manage the actual, I would say, cloud resources, where now the AI team, the developers, the data scientists are specifically managing the AI components. And that's where the different levels of permissions are becoming important. And then in the end, how does it work? In short, but you can already guess there's a demo coming up. You're going to define the Azure roles that you need for your AI team. And remember, the roles are partly living on the Azure side, like the resource management, but preferably for the AI developer, the data scientist, you're going to manage everything from within the hub and within the project. And that's also where you can define the users who can connect to the project and what permissions do they get. Where again, the permissions are based on RBAC. So you're going to think about what is my team like, what are the permissions that we need, who's going to manage what, and based on that, you're going to look into the already predefined RBAC roles, or you're going to create a custom role if the role that we provide out of the box within the Azure or Azure AI environment should not be relevant enough for the specifics of the role within your organization, within the team. I've been talking a lot about permissions. Why? Because it is obviously quite important, but even more so, I'm going to show you how to do that from within the Azure Resources environment, as well as using it from within the AI Studio. Now, in the previous demo, I might have jumped a little bit too fast, already teasing you around the model deployments, but I forgot something about how to manage our permissions, right? Now, the way it works is, again, I would say identical to managing traditional Azure resources. You learned already in meantime that Azure AI Service is an Azure resource. We talked about the managed identities. We talked about the different user profiles, like the data scientists using different portals. Where now the idea, or maybe the risk that you see is like, wait a minute, Peter, if we have our environment up and running, we have the AI service, we have the AI hub, we do have our project. What about permissions? Does it mean that everyone who has access to our Azure environment from an admin perspective can now all of a sudden start managing our AI resources and interacting with AI Studio? So obviously that's not at all the case. So what we need is defining RBAC permissions. So I'll start with the resources level. So I go back to the root of my Azure portal. I go into my resource group that I used for this environment. And just like any other RBAC permission in the platform, we go to access control and we're going to define the permissions. So as I explained before, we have our main Azure RBAC permissions, where we typically see owner, contributor, read permissions, where now I could also specifically specify the AI developer. Oh, it's probably Azure AI developer, but that's a job function. Where now we can define it a lot more granular. So we could define that anyone within my organization is now getting the Azure AI developer permission. We select the role and we allocate it to a user, a group, or we could also link it to managed identities. So I could go in the system managed identities, and now I can specify that my demo hub live that we created in the previous demo is now getting permissions to interact with my other AI service components. Even better, think back about bringing everything into our Azure AI Studio for as much as getting up and running as fast as possible, where we still have our hub parent scenario, where now if I refresh my portal, I go to the hub level. Down here, I can see a user section. So almost identical to managing permissions from an Azure resource perspective using RBAC, I could now create a new user, inviting the user into my environment. I would provide some name out of my user list or creating a new one. And again, we do have our different roles here. Now, owner, contributor, reader are the generic default users, where now you can see that preferably by default, we're going to allocate Azure AI developer. So two different ways to define RBAC from a resource group or resource level, or directly from within our hub. This concludes our session. Now, there are many ways to continue your learning journey. We encourage you to watch other videos in this course or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn using ak.ms/learn.